Hi dear friends, welcome to the CSS Learners Academy. Today we are going to talk about the Montagu-Chelmsford reforms of 1919. In the last lecture, as I have explained, the Minto-Morley reforms of 1909. So here we are going to discuss that what happened in this decade between 1909 and 1919. What were the important incidents that happened and why the people of India demanded another constitutional reforms? What was wrong with 1909 when it was implemented, and the other incidents on the international level as well as on the national level that forced the British to think about another reforms and then their implementation in 1919. After that, there would be a lecture covering the incidents from 1919 up to the Indian Government of India Act of 1935, and then there would be the last lecture covering the incidents from 1935 to the independence in 1947. The people who have not subscribed to the channel until this moment, I would like you to subscribe and become a partner in this program. So let's start with the Montagu-Chelmsford Reform. As we have discussed earlier, that in the year 1909, with the Indian Consuls Act, Muslims were pretty happy with the attitude of the British towards them. It is not only because the Muslims were considered as a community that had never happened before after the 1857 War of Independence, but it was because that Muslims were recognized as a political entity of Indian subcontinent, a community that has rights and that may have an important role in how to reshape and to formulate the structure of government of the British India. Therefore, we see that the demand of separate electorate of the Muslims, which was accepted by the British in the year 1909, and before that in the year 1905 we see the Partition of Bengal. Partition of Bengal was not the demand of the Muslim, it was made by Lord Curzon purely on the basis of administrative reasons, but it helped Muslims a lot in their general thinking towards the attitude of the British. Because in the province of Bengal, there were Muslims mostly who were peasants, the landless Muslims who were peasants and working on the lands of the Hindu landlords, who were famously known as the Bhadralogs. Now, these Hindus of Bengal, they have a kind of economic monopoly over the Muslims. They were the landlords, they were in the fields of trade and business with the East India Company. So they had a kind of economic monopoly over the Muslims, which was obviously they never intended to go. But with the partition of Bengal, now Muslims had a chance because they had another province. They had a chance to represent themselves in the government. Now, but Hindus obviously, as we have discussed earlier in Minto-Morley reforms, that they were not happy with the partition of Bengal and they initiated the Swadeshi movement, which ended in 1911 with the annulment of Bengal. Now, after 1909, Muslims were given different assurances that the partition of Bengal is a decision which cannot be reversed. It is a decision which is not only in favor of Muslims, but in the favor of Indian subcontinent as well as in the favor of British government. So this decision is not something which will be reversed, and several assurances and promises were made to the Muslim leaders. But later on we see that in the year 1911 the incident happened which is famously known as the annulment of the partition of Bengal. When Lord Hardinge became the Governor General of Indian subcontinent, and he announced at Delhi Darbar that the partition of Bengal is going to be annulled and that the decision of the British government was reversed. It was a blow to the Muslims, who termed this decision as the worst kind of betrayal. In the following years, we see some of the more important events that were going against the Muslims and showing the attitude of the British that is now not in favor of Muslims as it was in the year 1906 to 1909. And here we have an incident which is recorded in history as the Kanpur Mosque Incident of 1913. In the year 1912, the British decided that in the area of Uttar Pradesh, Kanpur, they had to widen a road. That road was at a location where there was a Hindu temple on one side and the Muslim mosque on the other side of the road. In order to widen that road, they need to demolish either the Hindu temple or the mosque. When the Hindus became aware of the incident, they met the governor of UP, Sir James Meston, and they recorded their protest over the decision of the government to demolish any part of the Hindu temple. The Muslims did the same thing, and James Meston even visited the mosque at Kanpur, but later on he decided that the eastern part of the mosque needs to be demolished in order to build the road. This created obviously an outrage among the Muslims of that area, and they strongly recorded their protest. The decision of the government was implemented nonetheless, and the mosque was demolished. After the demolition of this mosque, the Muslims all over the subcontinent were outraged, and Muslims arranged a protest on the 3rd of August. Now, Taylor, who was the magistrate of Kanpur, he was ordered by Meston to do anything that he has to do in order to control the people. So we see that Taylor ordered the open fire on the mob, which continued for 15 minutes and 600 cartridges were fired. Plenty of Muslims were killed and others were injured. This incident spread anger in the Muslims all over the Indian subcontinent. The Anjumans maintained by the Islamic organizations, they called the protest in different cities of India. Later on, Muslims were further outraged when Sir James Meston even issued the certificate to those people who were engaged in the firing of the Muslims. When this incident was reported to Lord Hardinge, he showed a blatant anger about this policy and strategy. He even called this policy as a stupid blunder. He visited the mosque himself, and then he compromised with the Muslims and allowed them to build a new building over the public road. But this incident nonetheless created a kind of awareness among the Muslims, and most of the prominent Muslim leaders joined Muslim League in the year 1913, including Muhammad Ali Jinnah. In the next year, 1914, we see that World War I erupted on the European continent. British were involved in this World War I directly, as there were the two blocks, the Central Forces and the Allied Forces. The Allied Forces were the British and the Soviet Union and Japan, whereas the Central Forces were the Austro-Hungarian Empire, Germany and the Ottoman Empire. World War I had obviously effects on the Indian subcontinent because the British now need troops to fight their war. Most of the soldiers fighting in the British army were not the British in their origin. They were the people of African colonies or the Indian subcontinent. So now that was a time for British to make concessions to the Indian people. And Quaid-e-Azam Muhammad Ali Jinnah was well aware of the situation. Quaid-e-Azam Muhammad Ali Jinnah, after joining the Muslim League in 1913, tried to make his efforts towards united India as his dream was. We know that the three advocates of Hindu-Muslim unity in the Indian subcontinent after Sir Syed Ahmad Khan were Surendranath Banerjee, Gokhale and Quaid-e-Azam Muhammad Ali Jinnah. So now there was a time for Muhammad Ali Jinnah to show his skills and to use his abilities towards uniting India under one flag. Therefore, because of his efforts, we see that the Congress and All India Muslim League came on one page and they demanded the right to self-rule. That happened in the year 1916. Lucknow Pact was first and unfortunately the last of its kind, and that showed the unity between Muslims and Hindus. Quaid-e-Azam Muhammad Ali Jinnah stated that instead of fighting on petty issues, why not to unite and to fight for a single cause of self-government. And because he believed that united India would be much better than the divided India. So the continuous struggle of Muhammad Ali Jinnah became fruitful in the year 1916, and we see a pact whose silent features are: separate electorate for the Muslims was accepted by Congress for the first time. Number second is that one-third representation of Muslims in the Imperial Legislative Council. A term of 5 years was fixed for the Imperial Legislative Council. No bill, resolution should be presented against any group or party. Revenue to be controlled by the provincial councils. Protection to both communities in the areas where they are in minority. These are some of the important points that were agreed between the Muslim League and Congress. But we can say that Lucknow Pact was a win-win side for both, as both communities had majorities and minorities in different parts of India. Their rights were thus regarded, recognized, and protected under the Lucknow Pact. And the Lucknow Pact also mentioned the reservations of both communities with the Indian Councils Act of 1909 and the need for constitutional reforms. In the same year, Muhammad Ali Jinnah initiated a movement which is known as the Home Rule Movement. Later on, prominent leaders like Bal Gangadhar Tilak also joined the Home Rule Movement. Unfortunately, it never lasted for long and it was dissolved after the failure of Lucknow Pact, because it was soon realized that Hindu and Muslims are completely different. They are two different nations, and all the efforts to make them unite under one flag are not going to be fruitful. In the following year, 1917, we see a very important event of Russian Revolution. There were two different revolutions, one in the February or March 1917 and the other one in the October 1917, known as the Bolshevik Revolution. We will talk about these revolutions in detail in the lecture of International Relations Paper 2. But here we can say that these revolutions had a great impact on the Indian people. The Indian people demanded that if the constitutional reforms are not underway for them, the British even had a fear that if we are not going to provide any kind of constitutional reforms or constitutional guarantees to the people of subcontinent, such kind of revolutions or the civil disobedience movements can follow. In the subsequent year, 1918, the World War I ended. And now there was the time for British to keep with their promises that they made during the war. So they were working on the constitutional reforms and they were presented to the Indian people in the year 1919, famously known as MontaguChelmsford Reforms or the Indian Councils Act of 1919. Edwin Montagu was the Secretary of State for India, who advocated in the British Parliament for the first time that the constitutional reforms of 1909 have not been fruitful. There were lacunas in the laws, and the people of India, they are demanding more representation in the government. Therefore, we need to work on some kind of constitutional reforms. Lord Chelmsford was made the Governor General of India, and both of them proposed these reforms, which later to be known as MontaguChelmsford Reforms. Number 1. Central control lost over provinces, subjects given to the provinces. So first we see that in the Councils Act of 1909, the center was all in all. Provincial assemblies were made, they were created, but the provincial assemblies had no authority. All of the things that they had to do, all of the subjects were under the direct command of the center, and they had to get approval from the center for any bill or any proposal that was being produced in the provincial assembly. So that condition was changed. Number 2 is the provincial subjects were introduced. Not only provincial assemblies were now more, they were given more responsibilities, but now they had their own subjects. The subjects were further divided into two different units known as the transferred subjects and the reserved subjects. Because of this duality, this is known as the system of diarchy. So system of diarchy was first introduced in the Indian Consuls Act of 1919. If you are being asked a kind of MCQ regarding this, you must remember that diarchy was introduced in Indian Consuls Act of 1919. Now, the transferred subjects and the reserved subjects were the two different categories. So, the consuls of ministers will make laws on the transferred subjects. That law then need to be signed by the governor. Whereas the reserved subjects were the sole discretion of the Governor General, he can make these laws and then implement them without any consent or without any approval of the elected members. So here what British did, they introduced the system of diarchy, they introduced the system of provincial assemblies, they made them more responsible, but what they did was that the actual subjects like defense, like revenue, and the administrative powers, these subjects were given to the reserved subjects, whereas the transferred subjects were subjects like education and health and all others which would not be very fruitful for the British. The third important point of MontaguChelmsford reforms is the bicameralism. Bicameralism means a system of the government which has two houses, the lower house and the upper house. In Pakistan, we have the lower house as National Assembly and the upper house as Senate. Likewise, different countries have different names, but there is a bicameralism, which means that the lower house and there is the upper house. In the Indian subcontinent, the upper house would be called as the Council of State, which would have 60 members and a 5-year terms, whereas there would be a lower house known as Legislative Assembly with 144 members and it would have a tenure of 3 years. Number 4 was the Viceroy Executive Council. In the Viceroy Executive Council, it will be comprised of 8 to 12 people and 3 of them should be Indians. Number 5 is the communal representation. In 1909, we saw that Muslims were given the separate electorate, but in 1919 that separate electorate was extended to all other communities, to the Sikh communities and to the Christians. I mean, different communities in India were given the right of separate electorate. Number 6 is the electoral franchise was extended. Electoral franchise means that who is eligible to vote. It is also different in different countries. Some countries fix some kind of age that the people who are above 18 years, they can cast a vote. Some countries say that education should be the criteria. So the electoral franchise were extended as compared to what it was in 1909. 7th number is the introduction of Public Service Commission. Public Service Commission was first introduced in MontaguChelmsford Reform 1919. After that, a Public Service Commission was established in the year 1926, where Indians would engage in the competitive examination and can enter the Indian Civil Services. Before that, Indian Civil Services was not there for the Indians. The British bureaucrats were there to run the system. Now, in Pakistan, we have two types of Public Service Commission: Federal Public Service Commission on the central level and Provincial Public Service Commission on the level of provinces. On the annual basis, these two commissions take the exams with the name of CSS for Federal Public Service Commission and PCS for Provincial Public Service Commission, and these are precisely the exams which you are here preparing for. Point number 9 is that in these reforms, it was established that these reforms would be in implementation for a period of 10 years. And after the expiry of these 10 years, there would be a separate commission made by the British who would come to India and who will see the implementation of these reforms. That commission, later to be known as Simon Commission, came in 1927 because of some incidents that we will study later on. but that was another provision of the Councils Act of 1919. Number 10 is that all bills were required to be signed by the Governor General, regardless of the bills being presented in the Provincial Assembly, whether they are in reserved or transferred, and where they are being, presented in the Imperial Legislative Council, Executive Council of Viceroy. All of them had to be signed by the Governor General to be made a law. The last and another important point is regarding the salary of the Secretary of State. In the Indian Councils Act 1919, it was stated that the salary of the Secretary of State for India should be derived from the Exchequer, the British Exchequer, and not from the Indian Treasury. So in conclusion, I would like to say that we have studied about the Minto-Morley reforms and their implementation in the next 10 years. We have studied the important events that happened in the following 10 years and their impact on the Indian society as well as on the British society, and why the MontaguChelmsford reforms were important. Then we have discussed the salient features and we have differentiated how this constitution was different from Indian Councils Act of 1909. It is true that it was much better than the previous act, but was it what Indians required? I think not. And that's why in the subsequent years we will see the continuous struggle of the Indian people to have a constitution of their own choice. And that is the reason that most of the times I say that the people argue that Quaid-e-Azam Muhammad Ali Jinnah was not a statesman. They argue that he was not a politician, and I say to them, that's true. A politician was not required. A statesman was not required. What we required in the history up to the partition was a competent lawyer, and fortunately Muhammad Ali Jinnah was that. If we see from the 1862, the Indian Councils Act of 1862, then 1909, then 1919, then 1935, and finally the partition, all of that is a constitutional debate, a purely legal debate. So a brilliant man with a legal mind could have done what Muhammad Ali Jinnah did. Anyways, our lecture has been concluded here, and I would like to offer any kind of assistance if you need. I have maintained a Facebook page with the name of CSS Learners Academy. There is a Twitter and Instagram account as well, where I try to publish articles on daily basis, both on the international and national topics. A website is currently underway where I will be going to upload the important books. I have selected 100 important books that cover all the syllabus of all the subjects of CSS. Those books will be uploaded on that website. Soon after creation, I will launch that website as well. Because I believe that this platform, the CSS Learners Academy, should be enough for you, and you can prepare for your CSS without spending a single rupee on anything. I mean, you will be provided with lectures, you will be provided with books, notes, and the study material in your journey of CSS. I wish all of you good luck for your coming exam. Thank you very much. Allah Hafiz.